How many times have you heard, or maybe you've said it yourself, I hate small talk. Small talk is dismissed, it's derided. For some people, it's loathed. I'm here today to defend small talk. Now, I'm not talking about, hey, isn't that strange weather, followed by a few moments of awkward silence and scuffling of feet. But to be fair, I'm not defending much more than that. What's the first movie you ever saw in a movie theater? I ask that question a lot. I'm paid to because in my working life, and to be honest, in my waking life, I ask a lot of questions. Professionally, I have a microphone. Socially, I just have this immense sense of curiosity. I ask the movie question because when someone comes into the radio station, we're going to record an interview. I need a few minutes from them, a few seconds actually, to get a volume level, to make sure that when the interview airs later on the radio, we'll be speaking at the same volume. I've discovered over time that that movie question provides enough syllables to get the right volume. I've also discovered over time that sometimes that question leads to an interesting conversation. I'll give you an example. Not that long ago, a woman came to KUAF to talk about a pretty serious subject. So I asked her to get the volume level, what's the first movie you remember seeing in a movie theater? She thought about it, and she said, Jaws. Right. Think about this. You see the first movie in a theater when you're 5 or 6 or 7, and she saw Jaws? So I asked her, I had to, who took you as a kid to see Jaws? She was kind of sheepish and finally said, my dad. Well, that led us to a brief conversation about sharks, about fear, and about, for her, growing up the kid of divorced parents. Then we went ahead and had the regular conversation about the topic we were scheduled to, and I think it went slightly better because we had actually made a connection. I think that's what small conversations can do. They can make a conversation. Chances are, you and I could sit down and maybe never come to full agreement about some certain subject. Same-sex marriage, availability of guns, how to attack the federal deficit. But I bet we could find common ground on this. If you get to know someone just a little bit, it's harder to yell at them or insult them, even if you're politically polar opposites. But I think small conversations can do more than that. I think they can sometimes help you out in business. I had a side job for a while. I was the play-by-play radio announcer for the Arkansas women's basketball team. This meant a dozen times or so a year, we would fly to an out-of-town game, a road trip. The team would have a practice, a shoot-around at the opponent's gym, get to know the floor, and then have an early curfew. I wasn't playing, so I had the luxury of exploring the town. Translation, finding a bar, because that's where you get some great conversations, and beer. So we were in Portland once. It was a 2-game swing. We were going to play Portland State one night, Oregon the next. First night we're staying in Portland, and I'm in a pretty nice hotel. It's bigger than a boutique hotel, but it's Portland, so it's kind of cool. And the hotel bar was really cool, about 100 local beers on draft and indie music playing. So I decided to stay there. Bartender comes up, takes my order. I would later find out he's a kindred spirit in this conversation world. But he came up to me, got my order, and then he looked at me and said, are you in a band? Side note, if you're a baby boomer, that's the coolest question you can be asked. He came back with the beer, and I said, no, I'm not in a band. Why would you ask that? He said, well, you kind of look like a guy that used to be in a band I follow. And then he followed that up with a question. He said, if you don't mind me asking, what do you do for a living? Oh, I said, I work at a public radio station out of the state. I'm the news director there. He said, oh, so you cover politics and stuff like that? I said, well, yeah, sometimes. But my favorite stories are when I find someone who's passionate about something that the rest of us know very little or nothing about, and you can talk to them about that. And he said, the bartender said, oh, man, too bad you can't interview my dad. He'd be a great subject for your show. Well, I'm intrigued, so I said, well, what does your dad do? And he said, it's a great story. He was working for a Fortune 500 company, climbing the corporate ladder, doing very well, headed to big things, and realized he wasn't happy. So he chucked it all and opened a kaleidoscope factory. Which is not what I thought he was going to say when he started that story. And I said, you're right, that would be a perfect subject for my show. And he started to walk away, and he said, well, if you're ever in Bella Vista, Arkansas, you got to look him up. I did. I did the story. Turns out the guy had listened to Ozarks at Large, too. Now, that was 2,000 miles and 2 beers, but I got a great story out of it. Admittedly, a coincidence, but I think these small conversations, whether they lead you to something in your job or a great story, can be helpful. Sometimes they give you a lesson that you'll never forget. One of the first stories I ever did for Ozarks at Large, 23 years ago, was at the World Championship Mule Jump Competition in Pea Ridge. Ever been there? You have to go. It's like a high jump or a pole vault. It's at the fairgrounds, and they bring out barricades, like a gate or a fence or something, and you can lead the mule up, the mule you own, with the reins, and then you coax verbally. You can't pull. You coax the mule to jump. Sometimes the mules do, sometimes they don't. They're mules, right? It's fascinating. The year I went, and it's competition. You can become the world champion. Honest to God, world champion, right? But the year I went, not part of the competition, but part of the exhibition, kind of the halftime show, was a guy, their local guy from Benton County, who had taught his Brahma bull to jump. You ever been by a Brahma bull? It's like nature's tank. These things are huge. Here's some journalism 101. If you're about to interview a guy who's taught his Brahma bull how to jump, you ask, why? He gave me one of my favorite, if not my very favorite answer ever. So I said, why? Why did you make your bull, named TG, I still remember the bull's name after the country singer T.G. Shepherd. So why did you make your bull TG jump? Honest answer. He said, well, the doctor told me after my 3rd heart attack that I had to slow down. And I'm 70% blind, so woodworking wouldn't be a good hobby. So I'm imagining this guy at his home outside of Gravette, or Gentry, I can't remember which now. I can't remember his name. I remember the bull's name, but I don't remember his. The bull was the one jumping, after all. I'm imagining this guy sitting at his kitchen table. He's had 3 heart attacks. He can't go out in the field anymore. The doctor has told him, you got to slow down. He looks out in the field, and maybe the only thing he can see because he's 70% blind is this Brahma bull, and he decides, I'm going to teach this Brahma bull to jump. And he did. I left that interview thinking to myself, always take on new challenges. I've never forgotten that lesson. Sometimes the small conversations can remind you something you already knew but needed to be reminded of. I was flying once back from D.C. I visited some friends in Washington, got on the plane, and I had the middle seat, which is okay for me. I got short legs. And the woman who had the aisle seat was already sitting there. And, you do that dance where, oh, this is my ticket, and she gets up, and you get in, you buckle in. I looked over, and I could tell she was a nervous flyer, because I'm a nervous flyer. And there are 2 things nervous flyers do. They medicate or they conversate. Because both of those take your mind off the fact you're in a tuna can 30,000 feet above the planet. So I look over, and I think she might be willing to talk. And I start the conversation. Are you from D.C.? Are you traveling home or whatever? And we start this small conversation. She asked me where I'm from. I tell her it's Northwest Arkansas. This was several years ago. She wanted to know what that was like. I told her, well, it's the home of Walmart, Arkansas Razorbacks. This was a few years ago. We're getting this museum. It's under construction now, Crystal Bridges. It's going to change everything. It's going to be great. You should come sometime. So I asked her, she asked me what I was doing. I said, visiting friends. I said, what were you doing in D.C.? She was there for a cat show. Right? There's the Westminster Dog Show. Apparently there are cat shows. And it turns out her cat had won the world champion title of its species, a species I'd never heard of before and forgot 2 or 3 minutes later. But it was a world champion cat. And she said, it's in the cat carrier below the seat here. I'm not supposed to take it out, but would you like to hold it? If you're ever on a plane and someone says, do you want to hold a world champion cat? You say yes. Because that's never going to happen again. So she took the cat out. And while we were conversating, it had been medicated. It was kind of calm, and it loved on me for a few minutes, purred, but it was pretty out of it. And we put it back into the carrier after only a minute or so. And so then I asked her where she lived. And it kind of got solemn for a moment. Turned out she lived in a small town in western Kansas, almost in Nebraska. I'd grown up in a small town and left, small town in Arkansas. I said, well, what's that small town like? She got real quiet for a second. She said, well, it's kind of fading away. There aren't really many jobs there. The young people, they'll move to North Platte or Omaha or Wichita, and we're kind of shrinking. And she said, it's getting hard just to get teachers to come teach at the school district there. And the Chamber of Commerce in the town, or what passed for the Chamber of Commerce, had put together a list of amenities for the town to attract would-be teachers, to sign a contract to teach there. Number one on the list, the thing they were the happiest about, the thing they thought would attract more people than anything, the public swimming pool. Something that every other town, it seems, takes for granted. And I knew right then I would never take for granted where I lived, a place that was vibrant and flourishing and always had something going on. And that lesson has stayed with me. Sometimes you don't learn necessarily anything from a conversation, but you're just glad you had it. Another basketball trip, we were traveling to Mississippi State, play Mississippi State. It was Starkville, Mississippi. I think if you live in Starkville, you know where to go to have a good time. But if you're visiting Starkville, it's one of those towns, it's a hard nut to crack. You don't know what to do. So I stayed in the hotel bar again. It was one of these express, not like 2 floors and all the stuff that a big chain would have, but smaller. So there was a hotel bar, but it was really odd. It was by the doors that open when you come in and right by the check-in desk and 3 stools and a bar. And you just sat there and it was very sterile. And you could order from 5 until 9, they would have beer. Nothing extravagant, Bud Light, Miller, that sort of thing. And you could get bar food, fried pickles or okra, something like that in a styrofoam container. So I'm sitting there. I have 1 beer. Even the bartender, the guy who's taking care of the bar, he can't talk to me because he's busy. It's boring. And so I think I'm going to finish this 1 beer, go upstairs to my hotel room, fall asleep watching Law & Order. There's not much going on in Starkville tonight. I'm about 2 sips away, and this woman comes up and sits down. She sits down heavy, like the weight of the world. And here's the thing. I get an idea when not to talk, right? I don't pester. If I'm on the plane next to you and you give me a 1-word answer and you open up SkyMall, I get it, message received. So I don't pester. So I'm not going to ask this woman. But she looks over at me and says, how you doing? What do you say 99% of the time when you're asked that? Good. And then you say, how you doing? 99% of the time, the response is that she's doing fine too. But she said, not so good. At this point, you can jump in or jump out, right? And it's okay. I don't think there's a wrong answer. But I was in Starkville with nothing to do. I've seen every Law & Order, so I said, well, what's the problem? Ends up telling me she was there for her mom's funeral. Her mom and her had been estranged for decades, if not their entire life. The siblings were estranged from the mother. This woman was estranged from her siblings. But she was the oldest, so she had the chore of coming to take care of the funeral and any probate. And she wasn't happy about it. So for about the next 15 or so minutes, she talked about the childhood she never had, the family she would see on television that she didn't have with her, and she just missed that. It made her angry, it made her melancholy, it made her sad. But that's the way life had, the hand that had been given to her. Her food was ready. She picked up the styrofoam. She's walking away. I say what you say 99% of the time in those situations. I hope things get better. And again, she surprised me. She said, well, they're not going to. But the last 20 minutes has meant the world to me. And it really made me feel good if it had made her feel good. And I think that's the lesson here, is that if you have these real conversations, albeit brief, you get to know someone, you make the connection. And maybe that connection is how your kid's soccer game went yesterday, or what the Razorbacks did last night, or what happened on the last episode of Mad Men. But I guarantee you, if you get to know that a person is worried that the town where they grew up and their parents grew up is vanishing, and they're bothered by that, or you talk to someone who is so excited about a life change their parent made, or you talk to someone who's still wishing for the childhood they never had and never could be, if you get to know that person, even though you're diametrically apart politically or socially or culturally, I guarantee you it's harder then to demagogue them. And if it's harder to do that, it's harder to draw a stereotype about them. And if it's harder to do that, it's harder to hate them. And maybe, ultimately, if it's harder to do all those things, it's harder to go to war with them. Thank you.